Welcome to SQL Handbook. My name is Shashain, and in this video, we're going to go through what is the logical processing order of an SQL query. Okay, so it's quite important for us to understand what this is when we're learning SQL. The reason why is because it helps you visualize how the data is processed when you run a query, right? And when you can visualize that, then you actually can write better queries for performance as well. And you also can understand why certain errors might come up as well when you're writing queries. I'll get into the errors a bit later, but just so you know, this is a very important topic and it should be taught quite early on when people are learning SQL. But anyways, let's get into it. Okay, so on the screen over here, you can see I have SQL Server Management Studio opened up and I have a simple query where we just are selecting some records from the employee table. And we have put in certain predicates where salary is greater than 50,000. And we're grouping the results by department. Actually, let me just show you the table before I keep going so you have a better understanding of what it looks like. So this is the employees table right over here, right? So we're selecting the department column. And what we're doing is we're getting a count of how many people are in each department, right? How many employees are there per department. And then what we're also doing is we're filtering the employees where the salaries are greater than 50,000. And then after we group it, we're just saying like filter the groups where each department has more than 2 employees at least, okay? And then order that data by the total number of employees in descending order. Okay, so now when you look at this query, you might be thinking that like other programming languages, SQL is processed from top to bottom, right? So from line number 1 to line number 6, because that's how other languages are processed, like Python or C#, right? But that's not the case with SQL. SQL is a declarative language, right? It's written like how we speak in English, right? Select from where it follows that kind of format. But when you are running a query to the database engine does not process it from top to bottom. It actually starts at the from clause. So the logical order of processing starts at the from clause, and then we go to the where clause, then the group by clause, then the having clause, and then we go to the select clause, and lastly, the order by clause, right? And I know you might be thinking like, there's also other clauses like joins and set operators and all these things. All that stuff is generally between the from and the where, but I've gone through, these are like the most basic and most, common clauses that we use, just to give you guys an idea. So this is what we're going to be talking about. And this is the logical order of processing of a SQL query: from, where, group by, having, select, order by. All right. So what does this mean? So when I say logical order of processing, I'm talking about this is how the database engine executes the query. Right? So this is what happens under the hood. So the first thing that happens, if, for example, in this query, if I talk to you about what's going on, first thing that happens is that the database engine gets all the data in the employees table. Okay? And then it uses the where predicate, this where clause, and filters all the records where salary is more than 50,000. Right? So then we get that subset of records. With that subset, we group the data on the department column, okay? And then when we have that subset, then we finally apply the having clause, which is now filtering on groups, right? That's why we say having filters on groups and where filters on rows. You might have heard of that, right? A common question is, what's the difference between where and having? Where filters on rows, because where is logically processed right after the from clause, and having is logically processed right after the group by clause. So where filters on the rows that are supplied from the from clause, having is supplied from the groups supplied after the group by clause, right? So then we have having, and we applied this condition, and then we pick the columns that are needed, right? We get the department column, and we apply the aggregate function count on the employee ID column, and then we finally order the data at the very end. Ordering is the very last thing that happens in the logical processing order of a SQL query, right? So now, knowing this, we can understand if we want the query to run, let's say we want the query to run efficiently, we want it to the best way for a query to run is to have less data as possible. That's why when you filter the where clause, it's good to put a filter in that takes out most of the records that you don't need, right? Because then you're able to process less data because you're starting with less data for the other processes in the order of processing. So when you have this way of thinking and able to filter things early on, it helps you write more efficient code. Now, what are some errors that you can come when you don't quite understand the logical order of processing? Well, things like this. So now you can see over here for the select clause, I've given an alias called total employees for this aggregate function that I'm doing count on employee ID, right? I've given an alias says as total employees. Now, if I were to take this and I paste it over here, would I be able to use this alias, total employees, let's say in the where clause? So instead of, let's say total employees, let me use this alias over here in the having clause. Instead of having count of employee ID, I use total employees. Would this work if I run this query? It does not. It says invalid column name, total employees. But you might be thinking, I have declared this over here. Why doesn't it work just if I use the alias over here in the having clause? And the reason why it doesn't work here is because the select clause is logically processed after the having clause. So the database engine does not even know when it's at this phase of the having clause phase, it doesn't know that you've given an alias called total employees to this count employee ID because the select clause has not been processed yet, right? It's only processed after the having clause. So it won't work here, but then with what I just said, we should be able to use a total employees column in the order by clause because the order by clause is after the select statement. So we're able to use a total employees column after the having clause, right? Because it's processed logically after that, right? Because we know it's from, where, group by, having, then select, and then order by. So order by is processed after select. That's why we can use total employees in the order by clause, but not in the having clause, right? I hope that makes sense to why you can use alias in order by and not in having. But all these misunderstandings where people get confused of using aliases in other parts of the code and not able to, and confuse why it works in order by and not in other parts is because logical process in order of a query. And as I've said, for optimization, it's very useful for us to understand how this works so that we're able to put most of the filtering up over here and then have less things later on in our query, which means less data is processed throughout the processing order, which is better for our query to run. I hope all this makes sense. If any questions about it, please feel free to ask in the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next video. See you soon.